I wasn't allowed in the wedding photos. My own son's wedding. His bride, a woman I'd only met a handful of times, a woman whose smile never quite reached her cool, appraising eyes, had decreed it. It's about the aesthetic, Mother Alice, my son, Thomas, had explained, his voice strained, his gaze fixed somewhere over my left shoulder. Candace wants a very specific look for the album, very modern, very curated. And, well, your style is a bit more traditional. It might clash. Clash. Like I was a badly chosen curtain fabric, an inconvenient piece of old furniture that didn't quite fit her minimalist decor. Her family, of course, her perfectly coiffed mother, her florid-faced father oozing new money, her vapidly smiling sisters in their identical, ridiculously expensive bridesmaid dresses, they were in every shot. Every carefully posed, professionally lit, Instagram-worthy moment. They were the desired aesthetic. I, his mother, the woman who had raised him, sacrificed for him, loved him with a fierceness that had shaped my entire existence, I was to be edited out. Discreetly ushered to the side when the photographer began to orchestrate the key family groupings. They thought my quiet acceptance of this public slight, my polite, pained smile, meant I was defeated, a relic of a past they were eager to Photoshop out of their glossy future. They didn't know that my silence was the sound of a decision hardening in my heart, a decision as irrevocable as the vows they were about to exchange. They didn't know that the clash they were so concerned about wasn't just about aesthetics, it was about values, about respect, about a lifetime of love being trampled under the stiletto heels of their shallow, self-serving ambition. And they certainly didn't know that the legacy I had carefully built, the fruits of a lifetime of hard work and quiet sacrifice, was about to be recurated, in a way they would find far more jarring than my traditional presence in their wedding album. This is the story of how I ensured my legacy reflected my worth, not their dismissive convenience. The lead-up to the wedding had been a masterclass in subtle, and not so subtle, exclusion. Candace, from the moment Thomas had nervously introduced her, had treated me with a cool, polite detachment that bordered on disdain. She was a woman who knew what she wanted, and what she wanted, it seemed, was a life scrubbed clean of any inconvenient reminders of Thomas's more modest, less glamorous, origins. My home, the small, comfortable house where Thomas had grown up, filled with the scent of baking and the comforting clutter of a life well lived, was clearly not up to her standards. Her visits were brief, her conversation stilted, her eyes constantly scanning my cherished possessions as if assessing their resale value, and finding it wanting. Thomas, my once warm, affectionate son, seemed to shrink in her presence, his opinions deferring to hers, his attempts to include me in their plans often met with a dismissive wave of her perfectly manicured hand. "Oh, Thomas, darling," she'd purr, "your mother wouldn't be interested in that." The wedding planning, I soon discovered, was to be an entirely Candace-centric affair. My offers to help, to address invitations, to bake the wedding cake, my lemon chiffon was legendary in our family, to arrange the flowers from my garden, were all politely, firmly, rejected. "It's all being handled by professionals, Mother Alice," Thomas would explain, his voice tinged with an apology he didn't quite seem to mean. "Candace has a very specific vision." That specific vision, it turned out, did not include much of Thomas's past, or, indeed, his mother. "I was not invited to the bridal shower, it's just for Candace's friends, Mom, you wouldn't know anyone." I was not consulted on the guest list, which seemed to consist primarily of Candace's extensive network of equally glossy, equally ambitious, acquaintances. Even the choice of venue, a ridiculously opulent country club an hour's drive away, felt like a deliberate attempt to create a barrier, a gilded cage from which I was to observe, but not truly participate. The issue of the wedding photos was the final, unbearable straw. Thomas had broached the subject awkwardly, a few weeks before the wedding, during one of his increasingly rare solo visits. He'd hemmed and hawed, avoiding my gaze, before finally blurting out Candace's decree. "She just feels, it's a very particular style they're going for," the photographer. "Very editorial. And she's worried, well, she's worried you might not fit in." Fit in. I, who had held him in my arms as a baby, who had nursed him through fevers, who had celebrated his every triumph and soothed his every sorrow. I, who had poured my life, my love, my very soul into raising him. I did not fit in. The words, so casually delivered, landed like a physical blow. I'd felt the blood drain from my face, a cold, sickening dread coiling in my stomach. "So, Thomas," I'd said, my voice barely a whisper, "you're telling me that your mother, the woman who gave you life, is not welcome in your wedding photographs?" He'd had the grace to look ashamed then, his eyes finally meeting mine, filled with a fleeting, miserable apology. "It's not like that, Mom. Of course, you're welcome at the wedding. It's just, the formal photos. Candace is very particular. And her mother, well, her mother agrees. It's about creating a cohesive look. Her mother. A woman whose primary contribution to Thomas's life thus far had been a series of thinly veiled criticisms of his career choices and his lack of polish. She, apparently, was the arbiter of cohesive looks. I hadn't argued. I hadn't pleaded. What was the point? The decision had clearly been made, a pact sealed between Candace and her equally shallow mother, with Thomas as a willing, or at least, a compliant, accomplice. I'd simply nodded, a polite, pained smile fixed on my face, the kind of smile women of my generation had perfected, a shield against a world that often sought to diminish them. But beneath that smile, a cold, hard anger was beginning to take root. An anger not just at Candace, but at Thomas, my son, for his weakness, his betrayal, his casual disregard for the woman who had loved him more than life itself. They thought I would simply fade into the background, a silent, uncomplaining spectator at their perfectly curated celebration. They had no idea that my silence was not surrender. It was the quiet gathering of a storm that was about to break over their glossy, self-satisfied world in a way they could never have anticipated. My legacy, I decided then and there, would be my own. And it would be a legacy they would not soon forget. The memory of Thomas as a child, a bright, inquisitive boy with a mop of unruly brown hair and a heart full of adventure, became a bittersweet counterpoint to the man he had become, a man so easily swayed by the superficial trappings of Candace's world. I remembered the hours we'd spent in the local library, his small hand clutching mine, his eyes wide with wonder as I read him tales of daring knights and faraway lands. I remembered his fierce determination to build the tallest Lego tower the world had ever seen, his triumphant shout when it finally, precariously, reached the ceiling. I remembered his teenage angst, his first heartbreak, the way he'd sought solace in my quiet kitchen, his unspoken grief eased by a slice of warm apple pie and a mother's patient, listening ear. Where had that boy gone? When had he been replaced by this stranger, this man who could so casually, so cruelly, dismiss his own mother at the behest of a woman he barely knew, a woman whose values seemed so antithetical to everything I had tried to instill in him? My sacrifices for Thomas had been legion, made not with a sense of martyrdom, but with the fierce, unquestioning love of a mother. When his father, my beloved Arthur, had passed away suddenly, leaving me a young widow with a 10-year-old boy to raise, the weight of the world had seemed to settle on my shoulders. But I had persevered. I'd taken on extra cleaning jobs, scrubbing other people's floors, polishing other people's silver, my hands raw, my back aching, all to ensure Thomas never wanted for anything, that he had the same opportunities as the other children in our small, close-knit community. I'd foregone new clothes, skipped meals, worked until I was bone-weary, all so he could have the best education, the chance to pursue his dreams. He'd been a good student, bright and ambitious. He'd won a scholarship to a prestigious university, and my heart had swelled with pride. I'd packed his bags, my tears a mixture of sorrow at his leaving and joy at his prospects. I'd believed then that I had raised a good man, a kind man, a man who would remember the sacrifices, the love, that had paved his way. How wrong I had been. The wedding day itself was a blur of forced smiles and carefully concealed pain. I wore a simple, elegant dress in a muted shade of blue, a deliberate contrast to the flamboyant, attention-grabbing outfits of Candace's relatives. I sat in the pew reserved for the groom's mother, a solitary figure in a sea of Candace's chattering, preening family. During the ceremony, I watched Thomas at the altar, his face a mask of nervous excitement. He looked handsome, I had to admit, in his perfectly tailored suit. But there was a hollowness in his eyes, a subtle tension around his mouth, that hadn't been there before Candace. Or perhaps I was just seeing him more clearly now, stripped of the loving illusions I had so long clung to. Candace, of course, was a vision in white, her smile radiant, her every movement practiced, polished. She looked like a magazine cover, beautiful, remote, and utterly devoid of any discernible warmth. The reception, held in the grand ballroom of the country club, was an exercise in opulent vulgarity. The flowers were overblown, the music too loud, the champagne flowed a little too freely. I found myself seated at a table with a collection of Thomas's equally bewildered, equally excluded, distant relatives, a great-aunt he hadn't seen in years, a second cousin twice removed. We made polite, stilted conversation, our shared sense of displacement an unspoken bond between us. And then came the photographs. The photographer, a trendy young man with an artfully disheveled haircut and an air of profound self-importance, began to orchestrate the family groupings with a theatrical flourish. Candace's family, of course, was front and center, a gleaming phalanx of smug self-satisfaction. They posed, they preened, they laughed on cue, their every move designed for maximum photographic impact. When it was time for the groom's side, the photographer, clearly briefed, called for Thomas and his immediate family. Thomas, his face flushed, his eyes darting nervously towards Candace, gestured vaguely in my direction. But before I could even rise from my seat, Candace's mother, a formidable woman with a helmet of lacquered blonde hair and a predatory smile, stepped forward, smoothly, effortlessly, inserting herself between Thomas and where I would have stood. "Oh, I think just Thomas and his lovely bride for this one, don't you, darling?" she cooed, her voice dripping with a saccharine sweetness that didn't quite mask the steel beneath. "We want to capture that perfect, romantic moment." The photographer, taking his cue, nodded enthusiastically. "Absolutely. Just the happy couple." And so, I sat, invisible, irrelevant, as my son and his new wife posed for their perfect, romantic moment, a moment from which I had been deliberately, pointedly, excluded. My great-aunt, a woman of formidable character herself, leaned towards me and whispered, her voice laced with a quiet fury, the unmitigated cheek of that woman. "If Arthur were here, he'd have something to say about this, I can tell you." I merely smiled, a tight, painful smile. But inside, the cold, hard anger I had felt weeks ago was now solidifying into a quiet, unshakable resolve. They thought they could erase me. They thought they could relegate me to the sidelines of my own son's life. They were about to learn that Alice Baxter was not a woman to be trifled with. My legacy, I vowed, would be a testament to that. The days following the wedding were filled with a strange, almost surreal, calm. The initial sting of the public humiliation had subsided, replaced by a cold, clear-eyed determination. I didn't expect an apology from Thomas, or from Candace, and none was forthcoming. Their silence was, in itself, a confirmation of their callous indifference. It was during this period of quiet reflection that my mind turned, with increasing clarity, to my will. My will, drafted years ago when Arthur was still alive, was a simple document, leaving everything, our modest but comfortable home, our equally modest savings, a few cherished family heirlooms, to Thomas, our only child. It had seemed, at the time, the natural, unquestionable course of action. But now, in the harsh light of recent events, it felt like a betrayal of myself, of Arthur's memory, of the very values we had tried to instill in our son. To reward Thomas's weakness, his complicity in Candace's cruel dismissal of me, with the fruits of our lifetime of hard work and sacrifice, felt wrong. Deeply, fundamentally, wrong. My legacy, I realized, needed to be more than just a transfer of assets. It needed to be a statement. A testament to what I believed in, what I valued. And what I valued, above all else, was kindness, respect, integrity, qualities that seemed to be in tragically short supply in Thomas and Candace's glossy, self-absorbed world. I knew exactly who embodied those qualities. Her name was Clara Evans, and she was a retired schoolteacher who lived a few streets away. Clara was a widow, like me, a woman of quiet strength, immense compassion, and a sharp, unwavering moral compass. We had become friends over the years, initially through our shared love of gardening, then through our book club, and eventually, through a deep, unspoken understanding of the joys and sorrows of a life well lived. Clara was not wealthy. She lived modestly on her teacher's pension, her small home filled with books, plants, and the lingering scent of home-baked bread. But she was rich in spirit, her generosity boundless. She volunteered at the local soup kitchen, tutored underprivileged children, and was always the first to offer a helping hand, a listening ear, a comforting presence, to anyone in need. She had been a rock for me after Arthur passed, her quiet, steadfast friendship a lifeline in the turbulent sea of my grief. She never judged, never pried, but was always there, with a cup of tea, a shared silence, or a well-timed piece of wise, gentle advice. The thought of leaving my home, my savings, to Clara, instead of to Thomas, began to take root in my mind, a small, audacious seed of an idea that quickly blossomed into a firm, unshakable conviction. It wasn't about punishing Thomas, not entirely. It was about honoring true worth. It was about ensuring that my legacy would nurture kindness, support integrity, reward a life lived with grace and compassion. It felt right. Empowering. A quiet act of defiance, a final assertion of my own values, my own agency. I called my solicitor, Mr. Henderson, a kind, elderly gentleman who had handled Arthur's affairs and my own for many years. "Mr. Henderson," I began, my voice clear and steady, "it's Alice Baxter. I need to make some rather significant changes to my will." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "Alice," he said, his voice tinged with a gentle concern, "is everything all right?" "Everything, Mr. Henderson," I replied, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing on my lips, "is about to be perfectly, wonderfully, all right." We scheduled an appointment for the following week. As I hung up the phone, I felt a lightness in my chest I hadn't experienced in years. The decision was made. My legacy would not be a reward for disrespect. It would be a celebration of true friendship, of quiet dignity, of a life lived with an open heart. And the thought of Thomas and Candace's faces, when they eventually learned of this recuration, well, that was just a small, rather satisfying, bonus. The meeting with Mr. Henderson was conducted with the quiet dignity and old-world courtesy that had always characterized his practice. He listened patiently as I explained my decision, my reasons, without embellishment, without undue emotion. I spoke of Thomas's wedding, of the deliberate exclusion, of the growing realization that my son and his wife did not value me, or the principles Arthur and I had held dear. I then spoke of Clara Evans, of her kindness, her integrity, her quiet, unassuming goodness. Mr. Henderson, a man who had seen more than his share of family dramas and disputed inheritances, did not seem surprised. He merely nodded, his expression thoughtful, his gaze missing nothing. "Alice," he said, when I had finished, "it is, of course, entirely your prerogative to dispose of your assets as you see fit. A will is a reflection of your final wishes, and those wishes are paramount. However," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "disinheriting a child, an only child, is a significant step. It can have repercussions. Not just emotional, but potentially legal, if Thomas were to contest it." "On what grounds could he contest it, Mr. Henderson?" I asked, my voice calm. "That his mother, of sound mind and body, chose to reward kindness and integrity over biological obligation that had been so thoroughly, so publicly, dishonored?" Mr. Henderson allowed himself a small, wry smile. "You put it very succinctly, Alice. And no, generally speaking, a person of sound mind is free to bequeath their estate to whomever they choose. We will, of course, ensure the new will is drafted with meticulous care, clearly stating your intentions, perhaps even including a clause explaining, in brief, non-contentious terms, your reasons for this disposition. This can sometimes deter frivolous challenges." We discussed the specifics. The house, my cherished home, would go to Clara, with the hope that she would find comfort and security within its walls for the remainder of her days. My savings, my investments, the few pieces of Arthur's mother's jewelry I still possessed, all to Clara. I made only one small provision for Thomas, Arthur's collection of antique woodworking tools, which had sat gathering dust in the garage for years. Thomas had once, as a boy, shown a fleeting interest in carpentry. Perhaps, I thought, it was a small, symbolic olive branch, a reminder of a simpler, happier time, of a father's legacy he had so carelessly squandered. Mr. Henderson nodded. A thoughtful, if somewhat pointed, gesture, Alice. The new will was drafted, reviewed, and signed, with Mr. Henderson's trusted secretary and a junior associate as witnesses. The process was surprisingly peaceful. There was no drama, no histrionics. Just a quiet, deliberate realignment of my final affairs, a silent but powerful assertion of my own will, in every sense of the word. Leaving Mr. Henderson's office that afternoon, I felt a profound sense of liberation. A burden I hadn't even fully realized I was carrying, the burden of expectation, of unreciprocated love, of silent disappointment, had been lifted. My future, and the future of what I left behind, was now firmly, unequivocally, in my own hands. I didn't tell Clara about the changes to my will. I didn't want to burden her with that knowledge, or to alter the natural, easy rhythm of our friendship. Our relationship was built on mutual respect and affection, not on any expectation of material gain, and I wished for it to remain that way. Thomas and Candace, meanwhile, continued in their self-absorbed bubble. There were no further attempts at contact from their end, no apologies, no acknowledgements. It was as if I had ceased to exist for them, a minor, inconvenient character written out of their grand, glossy narrative. And I, in turn, found myself thinking of them less and less. The anger, the hurt, though still present, no longer consumed me. I was too busy living my own life, rediscovering my own quiet joys, tending my garden, enjoying the companionship of true friends like Clara, women who valued me for who I was, not for what I might one day leave behind. My legacy, I knew, was secure. Not in the eyes of my son, perhaps, but in the eyes of those who understood the true meaning of worth, of kindness, of a life lived with integrity. And that, I realized, was a far more valuable inheritance than any amount of money or property. Life settled into a comfortable, if somewhat solitary, rhythm. The sting of Thomas and Candace's rejection, while never entirely absent, began to dull, overlaid by the quiet contentment of my daily routines and the steadfast companionship of friends like Clara. We'd spend long afternoons in her sun-drenched conservatory, surrounded by a riot of blooming orchids and trailing ivy, discussing books, current events, or simply sharing comfortable silences. Clara, with her gentle wisdom and her dry, understated humor, was a balm to my soul. She never pried into my family affairs, never offered unsolicited advice, but her quiet, unwavering support was a constant reassurance. She knew, I think, without my ever having to say it, that I was navigating a period of profound personal realignment. The seasons turned. My garden flourished under my renewed attention, the roses Arthur had planted years ago blooming with a vibrant, defiant beauty. I took up watercolor painting, a hobby I'd long neglected, finding a surprising solace in capturing the delicate hues of a sunset, the intricate patterns of a fallen leaf. My days were filled with small, quiet pleasures, a tapestry woven from simple, everyday moments. Then, one crisp autumn afternoon, as I was returning from my weekly trip to the farmer's market, my arms laden with apples and late-season tomatoes, I saw a familiar car parked outside my house. My heart gave a jolt. It was Thomas. Alone. He was leaning against the car, his hands thrust deep into the pockets of his expensive-looking overcoat, his expression unreadable. He looked older, tired, the confident swagger I remembered from the wedding noticeably absent. I hesitated for a moment, then continued up my garden path, my composure carefully maintained. "Thomas," I said, my voice neutral. "This is unexpected." He straightened up, his gaze meeting mine, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I saw a flicker of something other than arrogance or indifference in his eyes. Regret? Shame? It was hard to tell. "Mom," he began, his voice low, almost hesitant. Can we talk?" I unlocked my front door, my movements deliberate. "I suppose so, Thomas. Come in." The house felt suddenly smaller, the air thick with unspoken words, with years of accumulated hurt. We sat in the living room, the room where he had grown up, the room that held so many memories, both happy and painful. He didn't sit in Arthur's armchair, I noticed, choosing instead the less comfortable, less familiar, wingback chair by the window. I don't quite know where to begin, Mom, he stammered, his gaze fixed on the worn Persian rug at his feet. Perhaps, I suggested, my voice gentle but firm, you could begin with an apology. He looked up then, his eyes filled with a raw, undeniable pain. I am sorry, Mom, he said, the words barely a whisper. I am so sorry. For the wedding, for the photographs, for everything. There's no excuse. I was weak, and foolish, and I let Candace. I let her influence me in ways I knew were wrong. I betrayed you. And I've regretted it every single day since. His confession, so unexpected, so direct, hung in the air between us. I didn't speak, allowing him the space to continue. Things haven't been good, Mom, he went on, his voice thick with unshed tears. With Candace, I mean. The money, the lifestyle, it was all a sham. We're drowning in debt. Her parents, they're not as wealthy as they pretend. And Candace, she's not the woman I thought she was. Or perhaps, he added, a bitter edge to his voice, she is exactly the woman she always was, and I was just too blind, too infatuated, to see it. He looked at me then, his eyes pleading. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, Mom. I know I've hurt you terribly. But I miss you. I miss this. He gestured vaguely around the familiar room, his gaze lingering on the photographs of his father, of himself as a child. I listened, my heart a turmoil of conflicting emotions. The pain of his betrayal was still there, a deep, aching wound. But his confession, his apparent remorse, it chipped away at the wall of anger I had so carefully constructed. He was still my son, my child, and to see him so broken, so lost, it was a pain almost as profound as the one he had inflicted on me. Thomas, I said finally, my voice soft, apologies are easy words to say. True remorse is demonstrated in actions, in change. I know, Mom, he said. I know. And I want to change. I want to try and make things right. If you'll let me. The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken possibilities, with the weight of years of accumulated hurt. Could I let him back in? Could I trust him again? Did I even want to? The path ahead was uncertain, shrouded in doubt. But for the first time since that dreadful wedding day, a tiny, fragile flicker of something akin to hope began to stir within me. Not for a return to the past, that was impossible. But perhaps, just perhaps, for a different kind of future, a future where forgiveness, however hard-earned, however tentative, might find a way to bloom. The conversation with Thomas that autumn afternoon was not a magical absolution. It was the beginning of a long, arduous process, a slow, tentative dance of rebuilding trust where so much had been irrevocably broken. His visits became more frequent, always alone. Candace, he told me, was resistant to the idea of reconciliation. Their marriage, it seemed, was crumbling under the weight of financial stress and mutual recrimination. I listened, offering not advice, but a quiet, maternal presence, the kind he had so carelessly discarded, and now, it seemed, so desperately craved. He started helping around the house, small, unsolicited gestures. He fixed the leaky tap in the kitchen, the one he'd ignored for years. He mowed the lawn, raked the autumn leaves, his movements awkward at first, then gradually more confident. He spoke of his childhood, of his father, of memories I thought he had forgotten. He asked about my life, my friends, my painting. He seemed, genuinely, to want to reconnect, to understand the woman he had so grievously wounded. I remained cautious, my heart guarded. The changes to my will, the one that named Clara as my primary beneficiary, remained firmly in place. I made no mention of it to Thomas, nor did he ask. His focus, for now, seemed to be on mending the emotional fences, not on financial expectations. Clara, when I told her about Thomas's reappearance, listened with her usual quiet wisdom. People can change, Alice, she said. Or perhaps, they can find their way back to who they always were, before life, and bad choices, led them astray. But trust, once lost, is a precious, fragile thing. Guard your heart, dear friend. I took her words to heart. I allowed Thomas back into my life, but on my terms. There were boundaries, unspoken but clearly understood. There would be no more casual dismissals, no more taking my love, my presence, for granted. Christmas that year was a quiet affair. Thomas came for dinner, alone. He brought a small, thoughtfully chosen gift, a rare first edition of a book by one of my favorite poets. Candace, he said, was spending the holidays with her parents. The unspoken implication was that their separation was imminent, if not already a reality. We ate in comfortable silence, the ghosts of past Christmases, both happy and painful, hovering in the air. There was a new humility about Thomas, a quiet sadness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He was a man humbled by his mistakes, by the consequences of his choices. As the new year dawned, Thomas informed me that he and Candace were officially divorcing. The opulent lifestyle they had so desperately pursued had crumbled, leaving behind a trail of debt and bitterness. He was living in a small, rented apartment, working hard to rebuild his career, his finances, his life. He never asked me for money. He never hinted at any expectation of future inheritance. He simply showed up. For quiet Sunday lunches, for help with my garden, for long, meandering conversations about everything and nothing. He was, it seemed, slowly, painstakingly, trying to earn his way back, not into my will, but into my life. The journey was far from over. The scars of his betrayal, and Candace's cruelty, would likely always remain. But as I watched him that spring, carefully tending the rose bushes his father had planted, his brow furrowed in concentration, a new, tentative shoot of forgiveness began to unfurl in my heart. My legacy, I knew, was secure. It would honor kindness, integrity, true friendship. But perhaps, just perhaps, there was still room in my life, if not in my will, for a son who was finally, painfully, learning the true meaning of love, of respect, of family. The photographs from his wedding, the ones I wasn't allowed in, no longer held the same power to wound. They were just images, relics of a past that had, in its own strange, painful way, led to a present that was, if not perfect, then at least, hopeful. And sometimes, hope, however fragile, is the most precious legacy of all. The rebuilding of my relationship with Thomas was a delicate, unhurried affair, like tending a fragile seedling that needed careful nurturing to thrive. There were no grand pronouncements, no dramatic tearful reunions that wiped the slate clean. Instead, it was a tapestry woven from small, consistent acts of contrition on his part, and cautious, incremental extensions of trust on mine. He never again mentioned Candace, except in passing, to confirm their divorce was finalized. He seemed to focus entirely on his own path, his own atonement. He took a less prestigious, but more stable, job. He sold the flashy car he could no longer afford. He started volunteering at a local community center on weekends, helping troubled youths find their footing, a quiet act of service that spoke volumes more than any apology. My will remained unchanged. Clara Evans was still my heir, the recipient of the house and the bulk of my savings. I had explained this to Thomas, gently but firmly, early on in our tentative reconciliation. My decision regarding my legacy, Thomas, I'd said, was made from a place of deep conviction, about honoring the values I hold dear. It is not a reflection of my capacity to forgive you, or to love you as my son. But actions have lasting consequences, and this is one of them. To his credit, he had accepted it without argument, without a flicker of the old entitlement. I understand, Mom, he'd said, his voice quiet. I deserve nothing. Anything you choose to give me now, your time, your company, that's more than I have any right to expect. And so, our new relationship found its footing, not on the shifting sands of expectation or obligation, but on the firmer ground of mutual respect, earned, not assumed. He became a regular fixture in my quiet life. He'd bring over groceries, help with repairs around the house that were becoming more difficult for me to manage. We'd sit in the garden, sharing a pot of tea, talking about books we'd read, about the news of the day, about his father, Arthur, whose memory seemed to draw us closer. He started asking me about my own life, my childhood, my dreams, things he'd never shown an interest in before. It was as if he was seeing me, truly seeing me, for the first time, not just as Mom, but as Alice, a woman with her own history, her own unfulfilled aspirations, her own quiet strengths. One afternoon, he arrived with a small, slightly battered wooden box. "I found this in the attic of my rental place," he said, his voice hesitant. It was with some of Dad's old things I'd stored there and forgotten about. He opened the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, were Arthur's antique woodworking tools, the very ones I had bequeathed to him in my revised will. His eyes met mine, filled with a dawning understanding. You knew I'd find these, didn't you, Mom?" I simply smiled. "Your father was a good man, Thomas. He believed in the power of creating something beautiful, something lasting, with one's own hands. Perhaps," I added gently, "it's a legacy worth exploring." He didn't say anything, but he held the box carefully, reverently. The following week, he enrolled in a beginner's woodworking class at the local college. The clash that Candace had so feared, my traditional style versus her modern aesthetic, had, in the end, proven to be a far more profound clash of values. She had chosen the superficial, the ephemeral. Thomas, I hoped, was finally beginning to understand the enduring worth of the genuine, the handcrafted, the legacy of a father's quiet integrity. My own legacy, I knew, was secure. It would ensure Clara's comfort, support her quiet acts of kindness. And perhaps, in a small, unexpected way, it would also live on in the scent of sawdust in Thomas's small apartment, in the feel of polished wood beneath his hands, as he, too, began to create something new, something lasting, something beautiful, from the salvaged pieces of a life almost lost. The wedding photos, from which I had been so cruelly excluded, no longer mattered. The true picture of our family was being reassembled, slowly, painstakingly, not in a glossy album, but in the quiet moments of shared understanding, of hard-won forgiveness, of a love that, having weathered the storm, was finally, perhaps, finding its way home. The final years of my life were, unexpectedly, some of the most peaceful. Thomas, true to his quiet resolve, continued to be a steady, comforting presence. He never remarried, pouring his energies instead into his work, his woodworking, and his relationship with me. He built me a beautiful birdhouse for my garden, a perfect replica of the little cottage Arthur and I had honeymooned in, a gesture so thoughtful, so filled with an understanding of what truly mattered to me, that it brought tears to my eyes. Clara Evans, my dear friend and chosen heir, remained a constant source of joy and companionship. We'd spend hours together, sharing stories, laughter, and the comfortable silences of a friendship that needed no words. She knew, of course, about Thomas's slow return to my life, and she observed it with a gentle, non-judgmental wisdom. "Life has a funny way of surprising us, Alice," she'd said one afternoon, as we sat on my porch, watching Thomas carefully prune my roses. "Sometimes, the deepest wounds can lead to the most unexpected healing." I never changed my will again. Clara was still to inherit the house, my savings. It felt right. My legacy was a statement about values, about honoring true kindness and integrity. And Thomas, I believed, had finally come to understand, and even respect, that his inheritance would not be material, but something far more valuable, a second chance, a mended relationship, the quiet dignity of a life rebuilt on a foundation of humility and genuine remorse. When my time finally came, peacefully, in my own bed, with Thomas holding one hand and Clara the other, I felt a profound sense of completion. My life had been a journey of joys and sorrows, of love and loss, of betrayal and, ultimately, of a hard-won, resilient peace. I imagine the reading of the will was a quiet, dignified affair. Thomas, I know, would have been there, not with any expectation of gain, but out of respect for my final wishes. Candace, I heard, had long since faded into obscurity, her glossy world having crumbled into dust. Clara, I trust, would have accepted her inheritance with the same quiet grace and humility that had always characterized her. She would live in my house, tend my garden, and perhaps, occasionally, share a cup of tea with Thomas on the porch, two souls connected by their love for a woman who had, in her own quiet way, tried to make her corner of the world a little kinder, a little more just. My legacy, in the end, wasn't about who was in the wedding photos. It was about who was present in the heart. It was about the enduring power of love, the quiet strength of integrity, and the unexpected, often painful, paths we sometimes have to travel to find our way back to what truly matters. And as for those wedding photos? I imagine them gathering dust in some forgotten album, a glossy, irrelevant testament to a moment of shallow triumph, a footnote in a much larger, much richer, and ultimately, far more meaningful story, the story of a mother's enduring love, a son's difficult redemption, and a legacy built not on what was excluded, but on what was ultimately, and most importantly, embraced.